you know, it was a really busy session. It was a budget year, and because of the pandemic, a lot of bills were retained. So lawmakers will be studying them over the fall in committees and then bringing them back in January. So we're going to take a look at what their fall looks like, and then what we're hearing, at least for what's next for proposals in the spring. The window for LSRs, those legislative service requests for the House, started today, open today, will close on Friday. So we can probably get a pretty good idea of where lawmakers are headed and what they're thinking by the end of the week, by the end of the month. And then in October, that window for the Senate opens. So by late fall, we should have a pretty good idea of what 2022 will look like in terms of requests. I mean, as far as how it actually shakes out, that's always a mystery. So we'll find out then. But going through that, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. As we do go along, feel free to drop questions in the chat. If there are any that we don't get to, we can email the group. And if there are any that you have that you either don't feel comfortable bringing up today or that come to you later, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is christina@reachinghighernh.org. And at the end, there's also a contact slide. So we'll see it for short. We'll have that up as well. And so, you know, just to kick us off, we wanted to welcome our new network attendees. If this is your first time, if you've never been to one of these New Hampshire Education Network meetings before, wanted to extend a really warm welcome to you. We're really glad that you're here. As a reminder to new folks and to folks who are returning, this network is really an information sharing hub where we share, you know, key advancements at the state, federal, and local levels in terms of education policy. And really, network members share the goals of providing a high quality public education to all students in New Hampshire. And so this network is really meant to help connect people, help inform people on what's happening, how they can get involved, and that sort of thing. So welcome, glad to have you here, really excited for today, for our fall kickoff, and to really get into the fall. And then January will be here, I'm sure, before we all know it. So, all right. So now, you know, kicking off the session, this was a budget year, meaning that lawmakers set out a vision really for state spending for the next 2 years. Part of that process every year is to estimate the state's revenues and take a look at, you know, where state finances are so that they can plan accordingly. Since last year, there has been a lot of concern about state revenues because of the ongoing pandemic, but the state really ended up having a lot more money than I think they and a lot of people originally anticipated. They went into the final stretch of the budget season with about a $500 million increase in revenue projections and a $57 million surplus in the Education Trust Fund. That is quite a bit of money for the state, and they really did have the opportunity to make a big impact in a lot of areas, including education. That $57 million surplus was eye-popping for the committees for sure. They really did have the opportunity to make a big impact, and you know, after all, we have been experiencing this education funding crisis for what's decades now. And last budget season, in the one that had ended before, they had some temporary fixes, and they had that commission, they funded that commission to study school funding. So they really took a deep dive at that. So with that, you know, with the $57 million surplus, with this $500 million increase in revenue projections, sort of what did they do with it? There was a lot of conversation about it. There was a lot of back and forth. So at the end of the session, what ended up happening? We see a lot of these larger funding related proposals that were included in the budget. There was the School Funding Relief Fund, which will provide $35 million over the 2 years. And that's really an extension of one of the targeted programs that schools had this year that just ended, as well as the universal state property tax cut that, you know, that had a lot of conversation, that swept cut and payment to excess swept towns, that $100 million and the $15 million in payments. There's a lot of conversation around that because of the effect that it would have on our towns with low property tax bases. Our analysis found that would raise that in those cases. So that swept tax cut was pretty big. Lawmakers put $30 million into the school building aid fund over the biennium. They did fund 2 scholarship programs, the dual and concurrent enrollment program with $3 million over the biennium, and that provides scholarships for high school students who take dual and concurrent enrollment programs in STEM areas, as well as the Governor's Scholarship Program, which provides scholarships to Pell eligible students. And one of the other big ways that they're using those funds is through that statewide school voucher program. And we have it unknown at this table. As of right now, it really is unknown. We've heard numbers over the weekend, as late as this weekend, that said that about 1,000 students were enrolled. The initial numbers from the department were 28 students in that first year. And it's rolling enrollment. So we're really not sure yet. We should have a better feel for what those numbers were and the impact on the budget by mid-October, because there's an October 1st deadline for reporting for that, but we'll keep an eye on that. So those are really the big themes of how the state was using those funds. And we will really kind of see sort of as the biennium goes on, how that really does shake out. So getting to the big question, school vouchers, that's been a really big topic this year. The program was rolled into the budget, so it is in effect. It began enrolling students on September 1st. It was a really swift contract and rules process. It is pushing forward despite some serious legal and administrative concerns from the state's Legislative Oversight Committee. They actually raised over 70 questions and concerns in the about 10-page document. The main concerns, they had to do with privacy and student protections. The department had removed all oversight of the scholarship organization by the state. They removed protections for students' personal information in the rules, saying that some of those protections were in the contract with the Children's Scholarship Fund. But those are really big questions that remain, and the state board and department are working through a rulemaking process right now. They'd actually just voted on it last week to put in some permanent rules around that. I haven't gotten the chance to take a deep dive in to see if those concerns, the oversight and the student protections, were included in the new version of the rules, but we're expecting that to be a pretty big conversation through the fall as well. So, there were also a number of legal concerns with the actual statute, which we're really expecting to see some proposals put forth later this fall. And we will find out sort of how those shake out in the legislative process. And, as I've mentioned, we heard unofficial reports that about 1,000 students have enrolled so far in the EFA program. But I want to be clear that we don't know that actual number. We've heard 1,000, we've heard 1,500. There's no real hard, firm number that's been reported by the Department of Ed or the Children's Scholarship Fund at this point that I've seen. And we don't really know how many of those students were already enrolled in private and homeschool options, or how many of those students, disenrolled from their public schools into an EFA. So finding out the cost of that is going to be really, really tough until we figure out those numbers. Nevertheless, there's been a lot of concern over the price tag of the program. The Department of Ed anticipated that 28 students would enroll in the first year at the estimated cost of about $130,000 in this year. But with these new unofficial numbers, that cost could really go up to about $7 million, depending on where those students are coming from, because there's the cost of the scholarship, but there's also phase out grants if they transition from their public school to an EFA. And there has been a lot of concern among some lawmakers that there's no cap on the amount of school vouchers that the department can award or that the scholarship organization can award, and that those accounts are funded through the education trust fund. So it really leaves the trust fund wide open to potentially a very substantial cost. And as a reminder, you know, that trust fund, it funds our public schools, it funds our charter schools, it funds school building aid programs, and it funds a lot of other things. So it's not really just a question of, you know, that this program would cost so much money or not, it would cost X amount of dollars, but it also, there's that other layer that, you know, for every dollar that's being spent there, that is money that would traditionally be funding other programs related to public education. So that has been a concern among lawmakers that we've seen through the summer and will likely continue through the fall. So, you know, as I had mentioned, this fall, we will be watching that rulemaking process for the school voucher program. And come the spring, we'll also be seeing, you know, if lawmakers do address those recommendations from the Legislative Oversight Committee. Here you'll see this is just a screenshot of 2 of the pages of the Legislative Oversight Committee lawyers' feedback. There were over 70 significant concerns and questions. There were 9 pieces of recommended legislative fixes. And so we'll really be keeping a close eye on how that process plays out, what the new rules say, and whether, you know, the legislators will be taking up some of these concerns that those attorneys had raised. So in addition to the school voucher program, lawmakers also tackled school funding in the state budget, HB2. As we know, and if you've been on these calls before, it's a number you're probably pretty familiar with, but our schools were faced with an $89 million drop in state funding this year, this starting September, because of expiring aid programs, because of enrollment fluctuations due to the pandemic, and because of applications for school meals. So since one portion of state funding is tied to those applications, and last year there was universal lunch, districts had said that they had a lot of difficulty in getting those applications, which then affected that state funding stream. And so altogether, all of those things really set us up for an $89 million drop in state funding. Lawmakers did preserve about 70% of that drop by accounting for the enrollment numbers and the free and reduced lunch stream. So it preserved those, the pandemic related challenges, but you know, a $25 million gap does remain. There will be a $25 million reduction in state funding for public schools starting this September. And really it will affect our most vulnerable communities. These are communities that were hardest hit by the pandemic, and they were the ones that really benefited most from that targeted property tax relief program, the fiscal capacity disparity aid, which lawmakers had replaced with that universal statewide property tax cut. And so we will be watching that pretty closely as well, sort of how it plays out in real time. So as far as school funding goes, you know, how does it actually shake out? Lawmakers had replaced that $11.7 million enhanced targeted free and reduced lunch aid with a $17.5 million relief fund. So that's each year of the biennium for a total of $35 million. It cut the statewide education property tax by $100 million. Formerly last year, there was about $50 million of targeted aid for our school districts that had low property tax bases. They typically have higher property tax rates. That targeted program is gone, and now in 2023 there will be a swept reduction, and we'll explore the meaning of that in the next slide, but that is one big piece. And then finally there was a $30 million appropriation for the school building aid program. And just as a little bit of background, 12 projects were approved in the biennium for a total of $104 million. out of a proposed $231 million. So, you know, that $30 million is very much welcome for those districts that had submitted applications, but there's still quite a bit of school building aid projects that are waiting in the wings. There's been about a decade's worth of moratorium on that program, so a lot of districts have been watching how the building aid program sort of shakes out, and whether it would be funded and that kind of thing, because there are a lot of projects that are waiting. So revisiting that targeted disparity aid and that SWEP reduction. So it probably sounds super complicated trading that targeted disparity aid for that SWEP reduction, but hopefully this graphic can help sort of break it down a little bit. It would be a flat 27% reduction in the tax rate. So on your property tax bill, if last year, you know, there was a line for a statewide education property tax that was $1.83 per thousand, that will be reduced to $1.33 per thousand in every community in the state. And sounds great, like everyone's getting a tax cut. That had been the messaging for the proposal and everything else. But since it does replace that targeted tax program, we can see that the towns that really benefited from that targeted tax program will likely see tax increases. So in a place like Northumberland, for example, where the average home value is $111,000, they would save $56 because of the swept reduction. But because that targeted tax relief is going away, that will increase their property tax by about $600. So the net is they would likely experience about a $540 tax increase on their bill. And so you can see sort of how hopefully this helps illustrate a little bit the impact of trading that targeted relief for that more broad thing, broad tax cut. And so in Molten Borough, for example, where the average home value is $533,000, they're saving $267 on their tax bill because of the swept reduction. And they didn't receive any targeted funds before because of the way that the algorithm is. They are what is, quote, a property wealthy town, for better or worse of that messaging. But so they'll see on their tax bill a $267 tax savings because of that. In Derry, where the average home value is $385,000, and they benefited quite a bit from that fiscal capacity disparity aid, that targeted aid program, they're going to see about $166 tax increase. And again, these numbers, I mean, if you live in Derry and you get your tax bill next year and it doesn't go up $166, there are a lot of other factors in here. So places like Derry can reduce their budget in order to compensate for that change in state funding. There are a number of other things that they can do, but all things being equal, if we're just looking at that disparity aid, the effect that will have with the tax cut, this hopefully illustrates it a little bit more. All right, and so shifting now from the state budget to some of the other, quote, smaller programs, the budget really took up a lot of oxygen this session. So looking at some of the other bills that had passed that can also pretty substantially shape public ed in the state in the next couple of years. There were two bills in particular that will really weaken the barrier between public dollars and religious schooling. For years now, there have been a small group of lawmakers that have been pushing for some of these reforms, opening the door to allow public tax dollars to fund religious schools. And up until this past year, that door was pretty sealed shut. But this year, lawmakers passed House Bill 282 and House Bill 388. House Bill 282 expands town tuitioning programs to any public school district and to any school, public, private, or religious. So whereas before, town tuitioning programs, and as a reminder, tuitioning programs are agreements between a school district and usually before this year, another school district. I live in Deerfield and we don't have a high school. We have a K-8 school, and then we have a town tuition program with Concord, a high school to provide our high school. So we send all of our kids there. There's a tuition agreement there. HB 282, before those, a school district would be limited to tuitioning with non-sectarian private schools. So they could create a contract with a private school as long as it was non-religious. 282 expands that, and so now school districts can really tuition with any approved school, whether it's public, whether it's private, and even religious schools. Similarly, HB 388 allows parents to seek a school reassignment to a private religious school. So this is manifest education hardships, and this is reassignments based on student best interest. And with both of these, the statutes did allow for school districts and the private schools in particular to charge tuition to families. But we could also see a scenario where public local taxpayers would be paying the bill for these tuition agreements, these school reassignments, which is where sort of we see that weakening between public dollars, those local tax dollars paying for religious schools. All right, and finally, lawmakers passed a pretty large omnibus bill relating to career and technical education and career pathways. There is a lot of movement in this part of education. It's exciting. There's a lot happening. It seems like every week somebody on the Reaching Higher team is in some sort of meeting having to do with whether it's post-secondary, whether it's career pathways, all of those kinds of things. So there's a lot happening, movers and shakers. But this one, Senate Bill 148, it does a number of things. It requires that all school districts assess every incoming freshman's career interests, informs them of their opportunities to meet those goals, whether that's through career and technical education programs, whether it's extended learning opportunities, whether it's academic courses that they would need to take to get where they want to be, and that kind of thing. It requires all school districts to report on the number of credentials that they award annually. It requires school districts to report on the participation of college and career-ready pathway programs, including CTE, dual and concurrent enrollment programs like running Start in Early College, how many kids participate in ELOs, those kinds of things. So there's some pretty heavy reporting requirements in that aspect. And you know, a lot of schools do these assessments. They assess freshman career, they assess career interests, they really help guide students along their pathways. But these bills really provide the public with sort of the accounting of this and sort of give a more holistic picture of what's happening in our schools. SB 148 also allows high school sophomores to take dual enrollment courses and makes them eligible for that scholarship program that we had mentioned earlier. And it extends the donation period for CTE centers. So there was a donation, I believe it was the tax credit that was set to expire this year, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, and that extends that another 5 years to 2026. So those are a couple of things that Senate Bill 148 does. We have a document that Nicole and I have been working on that it's an omnibus bill, so it's like 7 or 10 bills really rolled into one, morphed into one. So we have another document that really walks through and talks about the implementation timeline for them and that kind of thing that we can release by the end of the week, and we can make that available for everyone because it does have some pretty substantial impacts on our middle schools, on our high schools, and other stakeholders. So we're watching that one pretty closely. Similarly, Senate Bill 147 Another omnibus bill, but one part of that of interest is that it requires all school districts to report on the number of students who complete the FAFSA, which is that federal application for financial aid, whether that's work study, whether that's federal student loans, those kinds of things. So it's really requiring school districts to say, you know, this many students completed it and that kind of thing, to provide a little bit more transparency there. And just, sorry, one more thing that I did want to say about all of this. There's a lot happening here. There's a lot of motion in that secondary school and pathway space. These bills are really building on that. There are a lot of study committees that are building on that. But one thing that we've heard, that I've heard in particular, that, you know, all of these reporting requirements, these offerings, building these systems, it's really great. There's a lot of awesome work happening, both within schools, between schools, partnerships, all of that kind of thing. Really great work, but it's really challenging because there's been no funding associated with them, and that we're hearing that it's really difficult to do a lot of this work under the current funding structure. So it's just the issue that really keeps on, it has a hand in everything. So when we think about school funding, when we go forward in the legislative session, you know, a lot of these things are things that we will have to consider, that lawmakers have to consider when they're talking about whether it's CTE, whether it's career pathways, all of those kinds of things. That was a big concern among stakeholders that we've heard. All right, so, you know, earlier in this year, lawmakers did set up a couple of study committees, two in particular. One has started their work, the other one has not, but there's a study committee around special education, so HB 581. It places the burden of proof on school districts in defending special ed programs and placements. And it also studies that special education dispute resolution process. And there's a lot of, the committee heard a lot of feedback in this realm. I won't pretend that I am a special ed expert, because I am not, but it is pretty consequential for a lot of students and a lot of families. So they have a report deadline of November 1st of this year. I haven't seen a meeting scheduled yet, but it's something that we will be following, keeping you informed of as well. And then finally, HB 304 set up a study committee to study what was originally career and technical education tuition and transportation, but has really expanded to encompass access and equity around CTE in general. So it has been considering a number of larger issues, specifically area regional agreements, things like calendar alignment, embedded credits, and a lot of other pieces. They have a little bit of a longer timeline. They have until November 2nd of next year to do their report, but that committee is doing a lot of work in that secondary spaced career pathways and CTE. So we're watching that one pretty closely as well. All right, so that was last session. And so, where are we heading next, specifically in the fall? There have been committees who have started meeting, specifically Ways and Means has started, Finance has started, a couple of others have started. And as I had mentioned, there's a lot of retained bills to work through, no matter the committee, but in education in particular. One of interest that we're tracking is Senate Bill 44. It's a workforce development bill, and it creates a workforce pathway program for people who were affected by COVID. And this program would upskill and train people who were displaced by the pandemic, and would train them for careers in high demand areas. It is in-house education right now. There hasn't been a work session scheduled for it yet, but we're watching that one, and we'll let you know when they start working on it. relating to school funding, there have been a number of bills retained and that they're looking at over the fall, but two of interest are HB 608, which replaces stabilization grants with targeted funding to districts with low property tax bases through fiscal capacity disparity aid, and also sets up some additional accountability requirements around state aid. And then HB 504, which is in House Ways and Means, that would collect the statewide education property tax to deposit into the education trust fund. And it would make some more changes to the low and moderate income property tax relief program. And those were recommendations of the commission to study school funding, but that is mostly tax related, and that one is in Ways and Means. That committee is working through that bill. Their next work session is on September 28th. And then finally, there are a number of privatization and school choice bills that have been retained. HB 20, that original school voucher bill, was retained. So if you look at the docket, you might see, that they have a work session on it, but that was rolled into the budget. So how far it will go is unclear, but since it was rolled in, I at least would anticipate them to say, oh, well, it's been rolled in, so there's no real further action needed. But in terms of school choice programs and privatization, there are two of interest. HB 455 creates an open enrollment public school system. So that allows parents to choose any public school in the state to send their child, even if they don't reside in that district. The House Education Committee retained it because there were a lot of open questions around how it would work, the mechanics of it and that kind of thing. And so we'll be watching sort of the direction that they go with that. There hasn't been a work session scheduled for that one yet, but we'll keep a pretty close eye on it. And then HB 607, which is was dubbed as a companion bill to the state education freedom account, that statewide school voucher program. So where this one would set up a local school voucher program. And so what that means in really broad terms is if you were to sign up for an EFA today, you would receive about $4,600 in that state grant. So they say that state grant would follow you. HB 607 would be another EFA, a locally funded EFA that would take your local spending on per student, put that into an account. So for example, if Deerfield, where I live, spends $16,000 per year on education per student, I would get the $4,000 from the state in one account, and then I would get, it's 85%, but just for the ease of math, I would get the remainder. So that 16,000 minus 4,000, that $12,000 in another account to spend on private school tuition, homeschooling expenses, other education expenses. So that one would provide local funding for that voucher program. And again, not sure of the fate of that. There was a lot of concern among the committee around how it would be funded, the impact to local taxpayers, the administration of the program. There were a lot of questions around there. So we'll really see how that shakes out. There hasn't been a work session on that one scheduled yet, but again, we're watching it. So we'll keep you informed for sure. And then, looking ahead to 2022, as I had said earlier, the LSR window opens today and goes until Friday for the House. And then for the Senate, it is in October, but whether it's through media, whether it's through conversations that we've had, whether it's through committee meetings, there have been a number of bills that we can expect this next year. One is amendments to the school voucher program. We've heard that both lifting the income restriction. So right now, families who make less than 300% of the federal poverty level are eligible. There's conversations about removing that income restriction so that all families in the state can apply for a school voucher program. There's that. There's limiting the number of students who can apply, capping that number. So whether it's 500 students per year, whether it's 1,000 students per year, whatever it is. So capping it, bills that relate to the oversight committee's concerns. So addressing those concerns, we would expect some of those bills. And then there are a number of other ones that would strengthen accountability, that would change the administration of the program, all of those kinds of things. So a lot of movement in that school voucher realm. We're expecting that. We would expect some school funding remedies and some tweaks, some proposals to do that. Half because we've heard of people in the media and committee meetings who have said they're going to propose those bills, and also because it happens every year, so we can pretty much count on it happening. Two that we've heard are ones that would require the Department of Ed to publish numbers on the annual cost of an adequate education. So there are minimum standards for public schools in terms of, there has to be a school counselor for every 500 students. There has to be, you have to provide school lunches. You have to do all of these kinds of things. And what does that actually cost? So that you can sort of compare it to, what does the state pay for now? So we would expect there to be something like that. There has been in the past, so a resurfacing of that. Another school funding related bill that we would expect has to do with the free and reduced lunch. So this year, the budget took care of this year's differentiated aid regarding that because of the challenges with collecting those school meal applications. There are a number of school districts who opted to continue that universal school lunch program this year. The federal government made it allowed states to choose. The New Hampshire Department of Ed allowed districts to choose. So sort of bringing that decision-making down to the local level. There have been a number of school districts who decided to continue with the universal school lunch program. And so we would expect there to be a bill that would allow districts to continue to receive state aid for those. And so if they can't meet, the same applications that they had been, that they wouldn't be penalized for that, just because, they opted into offering school meals to all of their students. So we would expect something around there. And then we would expect there to be a number of pieces of legislation around the higher education system merger. If you'll remember earlier this year, the governor had put in a proposal that would merge the community college system with the university system of New Hampshire. There was a study committee around it. There were a number of conversations. Ultimately, that was taken out of the budget to merge those two organizations into one larger higher education system. But Representative Karen Umberger, who served on one of the committees at one point, had said that she is interested in proposing some legislation that would continue with that process. So we would expect that as well. And then finally, we would expect some legislation having to do with career pathways, credentialing, secondary school redesign, all of those kinds of things. So we'll be looking for that as well.